Okay, Wallace, tell us when that cover was on Time magazine, now that we're recording.
1947. Hang on just a minute, I'll get that.
And this is C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis, right. And so being on the heels of World War II, and it was such a terrible, terrible time for everybody. Even the Brits, though they were successful and on the right side, they had to eat like paupers because they had just destroyed all their food supplies in the war effort. And for example, Lewis's friends, by his writing, were always sending him canned hams and foods from America for him to do with what he wanted. He had quite a friendship list there at Oxford. It's better than any of them could find to eat there, which I find astounding, but that's the ravages of war. So, and he had already written several strong books and that were pro-Christian. He himself had just come back to Christianity in 1931. I say come back because he was born in 1898, and his grandfather, he was from Belfast, Northern Ireland. His grandfather was a significant minister, Anglican priest in Belfast, and that was through his mother's side of the family. And they had to go to church on Sundays. And I'm sure they sat there and wiggled. He and Warnie, his brother Warren was 2 years older than he. And they lived with whatever the standing rule was at home, to be good, to listen well, and to, don't forget that this is the Lord's house, or whatever other maxims they had. And Warnie and by the way, CS stands for Clive Stapleton. And it is recorded that when Lewis was 4 years old, he was so fed up with that name, he stormed out into the front room where everybody was sitting and said from now on his name would be Jacksie, Jacksie, and Jack for short. And that became his name. And that's the way all the materials are popularized now with his name on it. And so he was doing some reading and some thinking already about what kind of plow pattern he wanted to leave in this Earth's surface. And anyway, the father was a very successful solicitor and was doing quite well in the legal business. They lived in a nice home and moved to a bigger, nicer one, even when the boys were younger. And it's called Little Lee, L-E-A. And that was their place of conscious rearing as young boys. It was filled with all kinds of tunnels, closets, doors, books stuck everywhere next to when the library case was full, like in my little office here, the books would get stacked up beside it. This was not an age of TV or of phones that could carry TV programs for you. And it was a thing that they did all the time, both of them read. By the way, Lewis's mother was a graduate of the Queen's College in Ireland, Northern Ireland. And that was very rare for somebody her age and her sex to be. And she was a mathematics major. By the way, Lewis was so bad at math, Jack, that was the only test into entrance at Oxford that he couldn't pass. He made A's and everything else, but he could never work out through mathematics. Just tell you that because some people treat him as a god, but he had limited intelligence like all of us. So anyway, in 1908, Jack was 10, Barney was 12. Mrs. Lewis was diagnosed with cancer. And apparently the doctors, the good ones, all the specialists they could get to, saw her with a case that that was really aggressive, and almost nothing they could do for it except to mitigate some of the pain. And of course, that included in the family serious talks about what was going on. The boys were quite intelligent and curious, and they wanted to know. They couldn't be shut out. They were already baptized and or christened into the Anglican, the Northern Ireland Anglican Church. And so they had times together when they prayed for her. And then as things progressed negatively, she got where she just would yell out in pain often. And there was very little they could do except to give her morphine. And then finally the news came to them that mother had died. Now, why is this important? Because these boys at that age, going to church, grandfather a minister, they were taught God was good, would take care of things, prayers would help. And Lewis, in his book, Surprised by Joy, which by the way is very readable, it's his autobiography of his life from his early days until his early 30s. He just gave up on God and believing in him. It reminded me of a passage in Mark Twain's Huck Finn, when Widow Watson was trying to teach Huck how to pray. She went to church all the time, took the boys with her, and she wanted to teach them about what the Bible was saying about God and Jesus and all that, and to pray as believers. And Huck just didn't get that. And she just double dog dared him to start learning to pray. Maybe some of you know this story. And he started praying earnestly for a particular thing. He wanted to get some fishing equipment so he could go out to the beautiful Mississippi River and catch some fish. And he got the fishing string, but he noticed the hook didn't come with it. So he went off and prayed and prayed and prayed for that hook, and it didn't come. And he just decided he'd push God's limit. God could deliver string, but he couldn't do fishing hooks. And so he becomes an unbeliever at that point in his life too. And that's the author's way, Twain, of setting the stage for what young Huck was going to be. One who questioned, one who was serious, one who was a thinker, one who still loved his companions and tried to get along with them, who could work with older people as well as children and so forth. And so somewhat, Lewis was having a Huck Finn experience, but didn't know it. Now, when his mother died, the father, Jack didn't get along with too well. Jack's father was a successful solicitor, and he was very melodramatic, and he more like lectured to the boys rather than talking to them. And he was also absolutely shattered over his wife's death. And that was so profound for him, he hardly could put one foot in front of the other, apparently, even get to work. And he had a housekeeper that stayed there with the boys, and he had almost nothing to say to them. I suspect it was because he broke down emotionally a lot and just couldn't handle all of that. And so anyway, he decided that he just couldn't stand that grief and worry about those boys. And he knew that they weren't in the best of hands as he left them alone every day. So he also was well enough off financially and as a professional man that he wanted to follow the English gentlemen who sent their sons to school, boarding schools. These would be like 5th and 6th grade, maybe up to the 11th or 12th grade, as we would know it, and would prepare them to go to the major universities and to be very good at reading and writing and the basics, and to get ahead in life. Apparently, he didn't have very good information, and the place he sent Jack to, and by the way, Warren's name was Warney all throughout. They went to a school in the middle part of England called Wynard, and Wynard was just crazy. It was on the edge of disappearing, and apparently Mr. Lewis never got that information. The living there was severe. The commonality was that the older boys picked on the younger ones, and so Warney and Jack were harassed a lot, and it was later discovered that the headmaster there was clinically insane. That's the reason he was such a strange teacher, and also harsh with his students. And Jack and Warney would write their dad saying, "Please get us out of this place. Please get us out of here." And he finally did. He finally leaned on them and they on him, and he got out. Jack is assigned to a pretty good boarding school right there in the Belfast area. And Warney starts showing a proclivity for wanting to maybe go on, and they send him into another school, I think in the Malvern area of England. Okay, so I'm setting the stage. Now, Warney and Jack are very close. They did almost everything together. And even though Warney's 2 years older than Jack, he treated Jack as an equal. And they thought up a lot of things. And they had minds that were very, very infused with fairy tales and legends. And they were quite idealistic in their thinking. And they started developing little schools with animal students in it, and that kind of thing, as children would at that point. But Jack and Warney being separated was hard on Jack. We think Warney handled it better. And so anyway, long and short of it, he grew up with a faith, but as he read and studied more and more, he felt like he was hearing things that would never pass any type of a test in a Sunday school class or worship service as being legitimate. So he starts working on unbelief, and he runs across, of course, quite a few in school who believe that. And up until age 33, he was an active, professing atheist. And he wrote about it, and he belittled the church, and he wanted nothing to do with it. And but he is sent off to a wonderful place to study under a man called Kirkpatrick, and he was called the Old Knock, K-N-O-C-K. This is the man who prepared Lewis's father for entrance into law school. And he was quite a teacher, and one-on-one, he taught very exacting things. He would not let you say one sentence that you couldn't prove every word of it was correct and that you knew what you were saying. And so for the whole time Lewis was there, he lived with Mr. Kirkpatrick and his wife, and got daily studies from him in languages and in classic things like history, the Greek and Roman Empire, and so forth. And he became quite good at it. And he actually took preparatory exams to get into Oxford. And he did all right on everything except his math. And I think they tried to give him another test, and that just didn't work out either. And that was about to fall through. And he withdrew and went back and studied some more so he could pass that math. But in the meanwhile, a very big, inconvenient, terrible thing happened. World War I started, 1914. And Warney, by contrast to Jaxie, had gone to Sandhurst, which is the equivalent of West Point here in America. He apparently liked the military, liked the regiment that was taught there, and scored very high on his exams and was admitted. So his life was at the best school available for military leadership, and he was doing well in it. Jaxie had to do some other things. He was sent to other schools and to prepare him to read and to do better. But he had another problem. He apparently had two strange thumbs. They had only one working connection down there at the base. He could not bend them. You know what that meant? There was hardly a single sport he could play. He couldn't hold a ball. He couldn't kick it around. He couldn't do some of the things all the guys at that age were doing. And guess what? They made fun of him. They persecuted him. It was horrible. I had a student in, I had a friend in Connecticut who was a son of a minister in the Reformed tradition. They went to our church in Wilton, and this young man and his wife had two fine sons. Now, Peter, the father, went to Rutgers and had done advanced studies and got a master's degree, MBA, I think, at Pennsylvania. And the wife had everything but her dissertation for a PhD at Brown. Very, very bright young couple. And they took a job with American, not American Express, but the Bank of America, and had to go to the West Coast to fulfill their assignments. And anyway, they came back and they decided to join our church and be with us. And as their boys grew up, they had two sons. The oldest boy was admitted to Groton. Do you know Groton? Does that ring any bells for you? That was a famous prep school that FDR went to. And that was quite an elite school, very hard to get into, very hard to, it's a rich man's school. The sons, the scions of the world had their kids there. And guess what? The son there, from my friend, was a good athlete and turned out to be a bright student. But he went through a horrible experience. He was gang raped at his own school. And I've checked with some people who have some dealings with some of those schools, and they don't put those two and two together, and you'll never hear from the administrators and the boards that those kinds of things happen. But apparently it was fairly widespread, and it was a horrible experience. My friend pulled out his son and would not allow the other son to go up there. And in addition to that, brought legal complaints against the school. And the who's who of America were lined up as alumni of that school, and they kept him from showing up and doing just about anything. He finally got to be on ABC TV on one of the weekly night shows to talk about this problem and how bad it was and how the world was ganging up against him and his son, not even giving them a possibility for a trial and a discussion about why this happened. Well, I say that because this was very much a pattern of what went on in the English schools. The guys were rough. They beat up people. They also molested them sexually. And these were going to be the great leaders of England, in the future. They would get training all along. They would have maybe harsh stipulations to follow in their life too. But if you were hanging out with them, you wanted to be like them, you had to think twice if you were a Christian about whether you could really put up with that lifestyle or not. So Lewis goes ahead, Jack goes through the prep school, and he is molested. I think we're pretty sure about that. That evidence isn't quite as firm, but he dislikes the teachers. He can't stand the students. The father puts him into a special school in Belfast, and he does well there. And finally, he gets to go to another school, I think Malvern, which was a good school that was prepped well for the guys who wanted to go to Oxford. And then Lewis went on to train with the Kirkpatrick or Old Knock and did well. World War I was absolutely horrendous on the cost to the Brits. They lost a whole generation of young men. There are hundreds of thousands, even millions of Englishmen who were killed, say nothing about the Germans and the French. Some of you might remember that the Italians were on the side of the Allies fighting the Germans. And in any case, Lewis went to the front. Now, this was unusual. He had already been admitted to Oxford. He had 1 year under his belt, and yet they were forming up a group to go into World War I. And there were enough there to have training and to get ready, and they had like a 15 or 16 week experiment to get ready and to go. Now here's Lewis, who was raised, in a peachy home with all kinds of preferences. He didn't work well with his hands because they didn't work as well as other people's. He was really bright. Everybody knew that. And he had to go to trench warfare in Western France. And within a few months came down with trench fever. It was bad enough they had to go back for rehabilitation in England. He healed from that and he goes back in. And this was getting 1917, pushing 1918. The war ended in November of 18. And Lewis was hurt by an artillery shell. He shot basically a terrible wound in the back from an artillery shell. And then to make matters worse, it was friendly fire. It was misplaced shots from British artillery people, but it still practically destroyed his life. And he went on back and had to go through more rehabilitation and work. And the good news is he survived it, but he had some shrapnel in him, I think, all the rest of his life. He met a young man at Oxford when they were training for the military. And he was an Irishman, also Northern Ireland. And Paddy, P-A-D-D-Y was his name. And he and Lewis became good friends. And they became such good friends. They knew they were going to a desperate war that they made a pact between themselves. And the pact was simply this: if one of them got killed, the other pledged to be a stand-in for the victim's family and to help the mother and father or existing family that was going to rely on him, but now would not have that privilege emotionally or physically. Well, Paddy was killed. And Jack remembered when he came back that he promised to work to help his family. That's when he met Mrs. Moore. Paddy and Jack had gone to eat a nice meal with Mrs. Moore before they were shipped overseas finally. And Jack liked her a lot, and she liked him, and was happy to see that Paddy was making high-class friends. They were not in the socioeconomic group that the Lewises were in. And so when Jack comes back and he finds that Mrs. Moore now has a young lady, her name skips, Maureen, I think, who's about 11 years old, and Mrs. Moore, who's now in her early 40s, and she is divorced and without any kind of income. And he said, I made a promise and I'm gonna do something about it. Now he's a guy that was admitted first to go work or to be trained in University College at Oxford, not at Magdalen, where he was well known, and to teach philosophy. And he had a small stipend that his father sent him. And these were called the poverty years of Jack. And when Jack was there, he used the stipend his father gave me, never mentioned to the father where the money was going. He moved into the house with Mrs. Moore and her daughter, and she was with them 30 years before she died. And Jack was her main support. Maureen married at age 40 to some noble person and came out quite well, and she and Jack were friends. But Mrs. Moore was just into Jack's life, and she was hard to live with. And when Warnie came home from the war, he couldn't stand Mrs. Moore. And Jack and Warnie lived together the rest of their lives. And they counted each other. Both were well-read scholars and published authors. And but Warnie had almost no understanding and no appreciation for her. Now, what she did was overmother them, and they were already grown men. And she also had a lot of duties underlined for them, and they couldn't do what they wanted to do in some of their scholarship and some of their socializing they'd like to do with their own kinds of folks. And she would call them maids sometimes, or bar boys, and whatever she had wanted done around the house, she called on them. And Jack chose to always, almost from what Warnie wrote in his book about Jack, to do what she asked and whatever he could around the home, make life easier. So they were helping in the kitchen. They moved to a new place called the Kilns, which was a nice home up at Headington Quarry, suburb of Oxford. And Jack could walk in or catch a bus into the main campus at Oxford. Warnie was there and got to proceed with his training. And anyway, but things got worse and worse. Now, another problem came up with Warnie. Turns out that he was a closet alcoholic and never, ever really got out of that. He and Jack were best friends, and Jack spent the rest of his life with Warnie, bailing him out and trying to help him. He was a good man, good author. He really loved his younger brother. But he absolutely, if he started drinking, just wouldn't stop, and was truly addicted. Well, that didn't ingratiate him with Mrs. Moore, and it made things even more complicated. But there they were in that particular place called the Kilns, and today that's celebrated as C.S. Lewis's home, and it's been nicely remodeled. And I had a student at Beeson Divinity School who was the first curator there, and he was telling me about the interesting people from all across the world that would come there just to be around there and work with them. Well, anyway, Jack, up to this point, was still an unbeliever. Now, I'm tracing his Christian life because today, what he's known for, not only for his ability as a writer, but also as a great mature advisor in Christianity in several ways. And while he's at Oxford, finishing up his own degree, he decides to go into 2 other areas. And he gets 3 first degrees from Oxford. Magdalen College, Oxford, then offers him a position to teach in their English department. His last degree was English. Along the way, he meets a guy that he really liked who was in another college in Oxford named J.R.R. Tolkien. And this man is a brilliant author. And they have a lot in common. Apparently, both of them loved Scandinavian mythology. And they learned some of the language, and they would get together and talk about it, and they formed a small club about it. It didn't last very long. But after a while, after Jack gets settled in his new regular position at Magdalen College in the English department, Jack starts calling people together that have similar literary interests to meet with him in his quarters. He has in what they call the New Hall, which meant it was built as late as the 1700s. Everything Oxford's was 1,000 years older than that. So anyway, and they met on Tuesday nights there. Every Thursday morning, in addition, they met at the Eagle and the Child Tavern, which is not too far from where they work. And they were literary people. They tried to agree on what they wanted to write on. They did the favor of openly and honestly and professionally critiquing each other's works. And Lewis helped Tolkien write The Hobbit. And Tolkien helped Lewis write Chronicles of Narnia. And, just improvements to be made here. You need to shape this a little better. This characterization is a little weak, whatever the things were. I'm sure they said some things that made them mad with each other too. But it was very important that these people met, because Jack was responsible for making sure that Tolkien seriously wanted to publish The Hobbit. And he got him to go to an editor, and sure enough, the man who was in that particular company was very impressed with that, wanted to go on with it, and all the rest of it, Now, it turns out that Tolkien got a little jealous of Warren. Most people think that he had a photographic memory. Why? Well, he became, as a servicing person in the Magdalen College English department, a tutor. Now, the tutors had a particular routine. All of you probably know about this. This is a one-on-one teaching from an experienced, qualified person. And all of a sudden, at a certain time in the morning, after the person inside had awakened with his morning tea and had been served his breakfast by the busboy that handled all the residents there, there would be a knock on the door, and this person would identify himself as a student and wanting to see Mr. Lewis, and he would come in. They would sit down, and he would hand the paper to Lewis that had been asked. Each they called the students toots. Each of the toots had to write an essay of around 10 to 12 pages about an assignment that they had agreed on the week before, and to do really good reading in that area. And they would come back and show that they had done research and were using it, and also that they had a good writing style. And the tutor would just sit there and listen, probably light a pipe up, or turn up the fire a little bit, maybe offer a bite to eat to them. It was kind of informal. But at the end of the presentation by the student, the tutor would then talk with the student and say, pick out a word or two about the student. Say, well, now, what did you think about this? And where did you find this word? And one of his closest students and his best was a man named George Sayer, Sayer, who eventually wrote probably the definitive biography on C.S. Lewis's life. And he became a lifelong friend of Lewis's. And I forgot what the word was, but he said, well, what does that word mean? And he would say 4 or 5 different things. It's showing he at least looked it up. And then Lewis would say, well, where does that fit in here? And he said, well, I'm not sure now that we've defined it so fully, it doesn't sound like it fits here. Then he'd look at the student and say, well, don't you think you ought to remove that word from this thesis and go on and be a little bit more particular about what language you use? This was a great, great test. Do you know the words you're using? Are they proper to what you want to do overall? And are you being faithful in doing that and learning and teaching yourself on that? I say that because it was a different experience from doing lectures. After a while, Lewis had written so many good things that had been published, he was asked to start giving lectures. And it was said he was one of the best lecturers in the whole university. Students would come in and be there all on time, huge lecture halls, and there every minute. And Lewis would come walking in lecturing and stay with them to his watch and the bell rang, and he'd walk out finishing the lecture. But they stayed around because he was really worth listening to, and he was really a significant teacher. Well, Lewis and Tolkien continued their friendship. There was another man at Oxford as a student in English. His name was Hugo Dyson. And as they got to know Jack better and better, this was the early 1930s, they couldn't understand why a man who had a grandfather that was a clergyman had gone to church, went perfunctorily to churches sometimes at that time, why he wouldn't profess Christ as his personal savior and believe in the things that they believe in and try to practice that. And so they started being very sensitive around Jack, not to inflame him, but also they were hatching behind the scenes what they could do to help. And long and short of it was, they came over to see him one night, to Hugo Dyson and J.R. Tolkien. And it was, close to 1 o'clock in the morning. I think they stayed until about 3 or 4 a.m. And they were trying to tell Jack, a man like you who knows all about mythology, who knows about fables, who knows about writing, why is it that you can't accept that in the Bible, there are significant narratives about Jesus to prove who he was? And Jack couldn't think of any reason why he wouldn't do that. And they cited all kinds of mythologies that Jack had read and studied in different languages and accepted what the storyline was. But when it got to the New Testament, he just wouldn't do that. And they said, well, this is absolutely essential. You don't walk into Christianity if you can't answer the question, who is Jesus Christ? And what is that to you? And so they were very helpful with them. And finally, after 4 o'clock in the morning, earlier than 4, Tolkien leaves. And Tolkien's Catholic, and Hugo Dyson, I think, is Protestant. And he talks some more with Jack about how he should read some more and think some more about this and see if he would truly understand this. And long and the short of it is, for the rest of that year, Jack records in his book, Surprised by Joy, how he moves along. And he names the different philosophical positions he's in, where he's studying, he believes that's ultimate reality. And then he gets to the point where he talks about, well, maybe he should consider this more. And he finally understands that is true. Now, recently, a movie was made on Lewis. And I thought I saw Dwight Moody's face in there a while ago. But Dwight wrote a nice piece, probably on his podcast, about this latest movie that's come out about C.S. Lewis. And I got to go see it. It was done in a premiere showing, and you had to have tickets to go. And I don't even know how they surfaced, but it was done in only a selection of movie theaters across the country, maybe 1,000. And you had to have a ticket to get in, and you had to have a reserved space. And it was called The Most Reluctant Convert. And Lewis described in his book surprised by Joy towards the very end of the book, when he knelt down in his room in Magdalen College and finally said God was God. And he said there wasn't a more reluctant or unhappy convert in all of England, the most reluctant convert. And but he did tell people about it, particularly his inner circle of friends. And so he records that he believed that God is God. From there on out, he starts reading more and studying more. He didn't say anything about the Trinity. Jesus wasn't on his list yet, and that didn't happen. Some others helped him follow through on that. And he finally professed Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. Then he told his brother Warney about it, and Warney finally converts over fully. And the movie ends with Warney and Jack going to communion at their local Headington Quarry church there. Trinity Church, was that the name of it, Dwight? I think it was. Yeah. And that was kind of the starting, saying, here is the pathway for Christianity. You must go to church. You need to go through the symbolism of these most important rituals of baptism and taking communion, and you need to be faithful in that. And then we're going to start teaching you about some of the disciplines that will help you with that. And so that begins his actual factual coming back to Christianity. And this was after he had left in about 1910. And here it was 1931. So 21 years of disbelief. And by the way, in his time of disbelief, he wrote negative comments. He took on other people. He said, nasty things in public groups. He wrote paragraphs in papers and things like this. And he was a pretty aggressive unbeliever. But he realized, he's back into a different position now. He was wrong. God's right. This is the way I'm going. And he's going to become helpful. Now, at the point when he was doing that, all he had written were books of poetry. And he had not yet written his literary academic books he needed to, and he had not yet written any Christian book, so to speak. But he did write his first book, I think it was 1933. And it's basically an echo version of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And I think I passed out to all of you a list of all the books that Warren's gotten into, and you might need to hear those and look at them. But this one is modeled on Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And he had a real affection for Bunyan. He'd studied Bunyan and knew how important he was, and knew that he came from a different kind of religious background, but nonetheless Christian. But under the apologetics and theology, let's see, which one is this one here? Christian present concerns, Paralandra. Let's see, 1933. The Pilgrim's Regress is what he called his, the Pilgrim's Regress. And it's interesting, it's like he's going shopping in a supermarket of different religious beliefs. And he meets some of the prime characters and prime teachers and leaders there, and that just doesn't fit what he is and what he sees Christianity ought to be for him. And so it kind of explains why he moves back into Anglicanism, and then he sticks with that. And from that position, he writes in the 1940s, 42, 43, 44, what has now become probably his most famous book, Mere Christianity. And as you know, this is comprised of BBC speeches said and taught over the radio to bring up the morale of the Christians and the searchers in England while they were being bombed by the Germans. It took a lot of thinking and a lot of working through while this was going on. And finally, he puts together these three separate topics he's working with, and it turns out to be about 25 lessons altogether, and they become this book, Mere Christianity. Now, at Beeson Divinity School, where I taught for 14 years, Fisher Humphreys was the main theologian. And Fisher was a good writer, had several books published about theology and things he was interested in, and philosophy. He had degrees in philosophy. He had gone to Oxford and studied. Really bright guy. And anyway, Lewis was interested in making sure that his formation of what he was specific, but not overbearing and not being flagged as the only way to be a Christian. And so that's what we used to call it, mere Christianity. And that was taken from Richard Baxter, who was a Puritan writer, but he was in his own way, Baxter, trying to not let groups get too idiosyncratic with each other and idealized and claiming they were the only true Christian church. And it's common sense. Now, these talks, this is the way I think Fisher saw it. Well, this is really a book of theology. It's a primary book of theology that ordinary people can understand. And it deals with the problems that Lewis had picked up on and learned from others in his teaching, and also his studies that he had done. And it's well researched, and it has this common sense approach to it. And every time he taught theology, he would require this as reading in addition to the book that he wrote, which was much more technical and thick with notes. It's a wonderful book, and I want to commend this to you. There have been all kinds of books out about this book and the effect of it. So here we get Lewis launched into his writings, and he becomes very popular. He wrote The Problem of Pain. As you well know, if you in the history of Christianity, one of the attacks that the world always brought against Christianity was, if God's so good, why does he let so many mean, bad things happen to people? And you have to answer that. Almost all the anti-Christians took that on as the definitive put down of Christianity. And so The Problem of Pain is Lewis thinking through the way the issue is being viewed, trying at some new angles and using common terms of explanation and help. And then frankly admitting that there's some mysteries in life that we simply don't understand, but that doesn't invalidate the authenticity of God. I don't know how many millions of copies have been sold in this, how many languages, but I put down in this little prefacing thing I sent to you that Lewis was credited with having several 100 million copies of his books out. And the last count I saw was in 24 different languages. Now, for a guy in a school that really wasn't a full professor, that was just astounding. It would be today. And a man, but here's the issue. He had been through 21 years of hate, discouragement, cynicism, and attacking Christianity. And he knew the arguments that people brought against why they weren't Christian, why they wouldn't believe it. And here he was as an English professor at a magnificent college and writing books like The Problem of Pain. And then to add insult to injury, a book about the devil called The Screwtape Letters. Now, a lot of people will tolerate having a good theologian talk with them about change your thinking, a little bit more practice this way, a little bit more thinking about this is okay. But if you go talking about the devil and do it earnestly, like he really exists and like he's really the enemy to fight, you lose a lot of people. That's just an area they just don't want to walk into. Am I not right? And if your experience as a pastor or a campus minister or a teacher, but the thing that Lewis got away with was he made it into a senior devil talking to a junior devil about how to trick Christians to getting out of the Christian herd and going their own way. Of course, we would say, well, once saved, always saved. That's a favorite phrase used in some denominations, including Baptists. And how do you deal with terrible tragedies and the pain that's there? And so The Problem of Pain is a very thoughtful book, and a lot of people put a lot of stock in it. There are people today who are on TV in prominent places who say that book got them through, and even though it was written in the early 1940s. There's nothing about it that's dated. It's very plain about what the issues are between harm and sickness and blessedness. And then you water it down a year later to, well, there's the demonic out there running a lot of this, and here's what their line of attack is. And everything is recommended there by Screwtape to his junior probate is how to trick Christians. And you can tell there's a tongue in cheek in every one of those, and it's the complete opposite, but it's showing up what it looks like and feels like when you're in the middle of it. And he also comes up with a way that it's handled and can be gotten past. So what else does Time Magazine had to do? Well, they pick up front page Time, a lot of people going through lots of doubt, lots of hurt from World War II. And they get a discussion on the evil one and how he does things to make people feel yucky and hopeless. And another one explaining, yes, pain comes, you've got cancers, you've got liver problems, you've got mental problems. Here's how we can work with some of those things in a positive way, moving in the right direction. And from there on out, his books just go wild. And so almost everything with his name on it. Now, it causes a problem. Some of you here have been teachers at seminaries, or several seminaries maybe, and you have found out after a while, you've got a note saying, well, you're no longer welcome here for some reason or the other. That's not very comfortable. Lewis was passed over 3 times for promotion to full professor. That's the equivalent of castrating somebody in the teaching business. With all of his books he had done. Now, you understand, he didn't just write Christian books. He wrote primary, well-used, important, centrally important literary books. Preface to Paradise Lost in 1942 he was a scholar of Milton. That's one of the most helpful things of all to read before you get into Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. He also wrote The Allegory of Love, and that was looked up to by all the literate scholars in Oxford, talking about the manners and the of love as it was expressed in those ages, and how today to react to people without crossing the boundaries that make think that you're after them sexually, but you're talking about the good and positive things of life. Then he writes other books along that line, and they all get outstanding reviews. Another one, Dwight wrote about this in his podcast. Right here on top. English literature in the 16th century. As a gift to my college, Georgetown, I gave him the complete set of Oxford History of English Lit. I was an English major and had a master's degree from UK in English and taught English for 4 years at UK and University of Louisville. And I found this extremely helpful. But the most astounding thing of all is when you get to book 2 in this particular issue. It says English literature in the 16th century without drama was finally added. People are thinking this is the key to Shakespearean studies. That's a separate book in that series. But this one's called Drab Age Prose, Religious Controversy and Translations. The astounding thing is what we learned from Lewis of how he got ready. He was a very serious scholar. He went into the Duke Humphrey. He was commissioned to do this in 1939. He turns in the completed work in 1954. He went to the Duke Humphrey Library and he read all of the works of Richard Hooker, the Anglican theologian. He read all of the writings of John Calvin. He read all of the works of Martin Luther. Now, Luther alone has 50-something volumes. He also read other books that were useful to him. The book by Otto. I should have written that down. I got it written right here somewhere. Let's see. No. Yeah. Thank you. It has to do about is it the absence of God? Is that the name of it? About Rudolph Otto, 1939. We had to read that in theology class at Southern. Okay, that's okay. So he does all this because he is such a serious scholar, and he also perhaps had a photographic mind. There's a wonderful story told about him to one of his tutors. Some of you know Kenneth Tynan, Tynan. He's prominent. He was an Oxford graduate, young student, was tongue-tied when he and stuttered all the time at Oxford. So a lot to overcome. Becomes a great drama critic and interested person in the theater and well known in England. And Lewis somehow gets hold of the information of how he remembers Tynan coming into his office the first time. And he was shaking. He couldn't speak very plainly. And Lewis would try to settle him down. He never harassed people or criticized them or belittled them. And he just said, okay, he said, here's what we're going to do, Mr. Tynan. He said, after you finish your pint over here and smoke a little bit more of your cigar, I want you to go to the shelf. I want you to pick out the shelf where you pick a book out. All right, you know, I'm going to go to the sixth shelf. Okay, Lewis says six. Okay, said, now I want you to pick out a book off the sixth shelf. And he picks one out. He puts the number. He says, well, that's 29 books into the edge. Okay, put 29 in. All right. Now I want you to turn to page so-and-so. You turn to the page. And he said, I want you to start on this line and to start reading. And Tynan stopped his stuttering and said, I can't believe it. This is exactly what you told me to do. And this was something you read, and this is the answer to it. It turns out that he did that a lot on students, and that's pretty close to photographic memory. And it's not to belittle them, but it's to tell them they need to read, study, and try to remember. And you can imagine that helped a lot in scholarship and in lecturing. By the way, Lewis was a very fine lay preacher. He preached in some of the strongest, biggest churches in Oxford and other places. And that's very important. And they say when he was announced to be the preacher, the place would be standing room only. And one of the most wonderful things he ever did was the writing of, or he spoke in St. Mary's on high. This must have been at Cambridge. And he wrote the, let's see here, I've got my copy, hang on just a second. I tried to read all 62 works of Lewis before I could come in here and speak intelligently to you all. I wasn't very successful in doing that. I went back over some of my notes that I had while I taught it. I taught him for almost 10 years at Beeson Divinity School. And the reason I did that was because when I was teaching freshman English at UK, we were to pick out a list of books that we were putting for our students to read, and they would do papers on them, and we'd describe what the essence of that paper was to be, and then we'd come back for an individual appointment with me. And their grade was based almost solely on reading and talking with me and doing well on those essays. That was very important. And so anyway, Lewis would do this with his students, but he'd never belittle them, and he would make them learn about the vocabulary they were using and what they were supposed to do. And then he'd just move them on out and keep going. Now, some of the students didn't like him, but he had a lot of students that did. And they helped make him even more famous. And as he was working with Kenneth Tynan, that one stuck out. But one of his greatest students was George Sayer. I counted 9 or 10 biographies of Lewis, and they range from all kinds of ways to great appreciation to almost holy worship, that he never said anything wrong or did anything wrong, and everything was all right. But George Sayer, S-A-Y-E-R, his book came out in the late 70s, and he was a student of Lewis's and then became a very good friend and was with him in a lot of other enterprises, trying to help one another with their writings and their friendship and help. And his book on Jack is very important. Hang on a minute. I thought I had all my books stacked up nicely in this room so I could get to them when I needed to, but I couldn't get all 62 of them in, so I had to sort out bits and pieces. But I'm just going to say that that was one of the best things. Now, George knew enough about Lewis that he was able to answer a very sensitive question. People who really liked Lewis wondered, could anybody be this good, this helpful, this kind, and this smart all at once, and at the same time be an active, practicing, regular Christian? And so people would investigate, well, we can't wait to see what kind of dirt we can dig up on this guy, and we'll find out. And one of the most examined parts of Lewis's life is when he lived with Mrs. Moore. She was 40, in her early 40s, when she moved in with her daughter, and he was 21, fresh out of the war, wounded twice, hurt twice, gone through the horrors of World War I, the trenches. By the way, he rounded up a whole group of Germans right before he came back without even pulling his pistol out. And his commanding officer said, "You don't ever bring prisoners in, Mr. Lewis, without a gun showing." But at the end of the war at that time. Anyway, Lewis, question is, people wonder, well, he called her Minto, M-I-N-T-O, named after her favorite candy. And he tolerated all of her excesses like Warnie never could. He helped around the house, Lewis did, helped with cooking. He would go dust mop. He would go out and cut the flowers and trim them. He would spend time with the chickens. I mean, it wasn't that he just occasionally stopped writing and went help him fix a pot of coffee or something. He was pretty regularly involved in keeping the kilns in decent shape. And he hardly ever groused back at her. He might have some time, but it's not recorded. And so some people said, now where is her bedroom and his bedroom? That's good modern thinking, right? And they decided that it's possible that for a while they had sexual relations. Some people, Sayer, who I think is a trustworthy biographer, thinks that maybe as a young British soldier back from war, and as somebody who was lonesome himself after they got to know each other, that perhaps they had a romantic relationship. But here's another thing. When Warnie couldn't stand her and was trying to leave the house all the time, Jack told Warnie, "We're taking care of this lady to the end. She dies herself of cancer in 1951. And he had promised Patty Moore that he would take care of his mother. And he did it right to the end. So he was faithful what he promised and what he said. And I don't know, I can't find any more materials that give any more detail about that, except that it appeals to some people's minds and hearts to think about that. The pictures I've seen of her was that she wasn't such a great looker. And particularly if she was trying to act as a mom and pushing around, that wouldn't do much for a romantic relationship, but who knows? And the fact is, the daughter wasn't bothered. She married well. She shows up for the funeral for the mother. And so that's that. And Jack stayed single. Now, we had a wonderful former Oxford professor who came and taught at Beeson practically every summer. And he was from the Hereford College, and he was one of the officers. And his name was Jim Houston. And Jim was friends with Lewis. He actually overlapped at Oxford with Lewis. Lewis was the younger of the two, and they became friends and they helped each other. And Jim tried to get to know him and appreciate what he was writing, what he was doing. Jim is the ex principal of the Regent's College, not the one in Norfolk, but at University of British Columbia in Vancouver, following English methods of teaching, interdenominational, and really, really brainy. And Jim said how much he thought of Lewis and what he got to know about him. And he personally thinks that maybe George Sayer was right. So I just put that in there. He's not a guy that goes around looking for trash on people, but he had some other connections. But he also knew that Lewis was a long time single. And he told us something in class I was the guardian of the class and the keeper of the papers and books and all for him when he would teach. And he said, you know, in Oxford, you were laughed at if you were married. Did you know that? That they preferred that you be single because it gave you more time and energy to work at all kinds of hours and keep your focus really primarily involved in your scholarship and your lectures. And I'm thinking, that's a crazy system. This is not a convent, and they wanted people to be single. So Jack got letters. By the way, he was one of the world's great letter writers. It's estimated during his lifetime, maybe as many as 12,000 letters came to him from his books and works. And he wrote almost all of them back. He was one of the great letter writers. That was one of the great qualities of him. And if they were children, he would write it in their language and thank them for reading his books and explain to them whatever mysteries they had. And so it went. And in this case, Jack was looked at as somebody who was one who kept his vows, did what he said he was going to do, and was indeed a great scholar and writer. And I wrote an article about Lewis because I've been wanting to for a long time. And we published a book at Beeson about, hang on just a minute. For All the Saints, Evangelical Theology and Christian Spirituality. And we had Dallas Willard, we had Alistair McGrath, former principal at the Oxford School of Theology there. We had Marva Doan, we had Ralph Wood, some of you know him, he's at Baylor, a wonderful teacher of theology and literature. We had, who else? Calvin Miller, who was on our faculty at that time, a very good writer. And they all contributed. And I got stuck with one down here next to Calvin's, which wasn't very good because his was better written than mine. But I enjoyed doing mine because I took how Lewis was the real thing and was a good writer. And I chose to walk through the celebration of discipline, which has 12 disciplines that are considered common. And they were grouped into 3 groups, 4 of each of those kinds. And wrote using that as a grid and showing evidence of that in Lewis's life. Now, why did I say that? Because when you've got a private life, you've got your own beer and wine for you available in your kitchen and dining hall. You're your own boss. You're supposed to be reading and thinking. You have a lot of things you can do that certainly maybe wouldn't fit the all-stars list for a lot of churches. But Lewis was very conscientious about practicing what he preached. And I try to show that. And he's written some of the best stuff on prayer that I've ever read. And it's been meaningful to me. And I use it a lot. And I would recommend uh, what he wrote about that. And let me just give you a hint here of that, if I can do that just a minute here. The inward disciplines are meditation, fasting, study, prayer. Both Foster and Lewis believe prayer to be central to the creating and life-changing, quote unquote. The entire community of the Trinity calls us to pray. The Father creates us with the capacity to commune with him and initiates in us the desire to do so. Jesus the Son taught us to pray, gave us authority for access to God through his shed blood, and embodied a life of prayerful obedience for us to follow the Holy Spirit, who helps us in our prayer weakness and intercedes for us with groans and words that cannot be expressed. Romans 8:26, you probably recognize. And here's what I like, a quote from Lewis himself. This came from his book. His last book was Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. It was in the galleys and already at the printers in 1964, and Lewis died in 1963. And he says, the prayer preceding all prayers is, may it be the real I who speaks, may it be the real thou that I speak to. Infinitely various are the levels from which we pray. Emotional intensity is in itself no proof of spiritual depth. If we pray in terror, we shall pray earnestly. It only proves that terror is an earnest emotion. Only God himself can let the bucket down to the depths in us. And on the other side, he must constantly work as the iconoclast. Every idea of him we form, he must in mercy shatter. The most blessed result of prayers would be to rise, thinking, but I never knew before, I never dreamed. He says, I suppose it was such a moment that Thomas Aquinas said of all of his own written theology, it reminds me of straw. There's something about that I think is just terribly insightful. Preface to praying, God, may the real me meet the real you. I don't want to talk through shibboleths. I don't want to repeat things I've heard here and there. I want to make contact with you. Now, behind that deep personal thing is to spend time in meditation. And Lewis would say he spent a lot of time doing that. He never had a TV. He never had a typewriter. He hand wrote all things. He never traveled to America. He lived a very focused life on doing what he thought he ought to do, which was to read, to think, and to write. And he did that for hours and hours every day. And of course, he would spend time with friends of his, and the Inklings got started at that time. And Tolkien was in it, and others. And it changed through the years as some of them got older and left, and some new ones came in. But that's a fascinating group to study. But can you imagine that we would never have had Tolkien and The Hobbit if Lewis hadn't been there helping him to write that, get that going? Now, Tolkien got jealous of Lewis because Lewis could write 10 times faster than Tolkien could. And Tolkien would be struggling with how to make the Elfish language sound like it was real. And Jack would have done already 7 books on the Chronicles of Narnia. By the way, the Chronicles of Narnia are still active. They won the Peabody Award. They're still active for children's literature. And I have met many a missionary that I've known in Southern Baptist life who said when they had only a few books they could take with them in moving to overseas, they would take the Chronicles of Narnia. Have any of you here read the Chronicles of Narnia? You have? Well, some people say, well, that's children's literature. No, it's not. It's written very well. It's written so children can understand it, but I would commend it most highly. And there were 3 movies made by Jackson, the director, They broke all kinds of records for people coming in. And 3 of the 7 were done by him. They were marvelous movies, and those were done in the 90s. I had invitations to Anglican churches, Presbyterian churches, Baptist churches to come talk about Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia. They were well done and masterfully published in different kinds of forms. And you won't be bored if you read one. Once you get inside it, you understand it. Lewis would get letters from children all across the world who had read the Chronicles of Narnia. And he would say he'd always try to write a letter in the same language that the writer did, at a level he or she would understand, with a complimentary type of affirmation about thank you for writing me. It's a thrill for an author to get a letter from a reader. And then he would say, by the way, he said, I love the way children read these books. He said, they understand the secrets of these books. Most of their parents don't. And he's got all kinds of letters like that showing how important he is, or that those books are. Well, so prayer, meditation, all very worthwhile, very important. Also, study. I think I told you already about how Lewis wrote that book, English Literature in the 16th Century, and that he took all the way from 1939 to 1954 to turn it in. First of all, I think if any of you tried that, your contract would be gone. You wouldn't be getting any royalties or any paying for that. But 14 years, and the books he read, my goodness. I don't know if he probably didn't let himself read Karl Barth, because I think there were 9,000 pages of Barth. So maybe after having read Thomas Hooker from the Anglicans, and having read John Calvin in his books, that's enough. Then you get to the 50 books of Luther, and then he decided to read another theologian's works, and just not quite as many books. But he had it down pretty pat at that point. He was trying to get inside that period to understand how people thought. This is one of his great traits. If you read anything of Lewis's, and he's writing about times past, he will reflect that he has read historians, philosophers, and fiction writers of that period. And then he knows what the thinking was like and what influenced him, because he knows the great secret. You don't pick out a book and just say you've got it. You've got to understand the milieu of the writer and what the times were about to see what he's writing about and responding to. And if you can't do that, you're going to miss a lot of the interpretation of that book. Okay, I told you Lewis was a good preacher, and one of his most famous sermons is called "The Weight of Glory." The Weight of Glory. And he spoke this in time of war at one of the major churches in Oxford, and standing room only. And he talked about how important all people are, how unique we are in creation, how important it is for us to understand. He said, you will never meet anybody more important than the people you meet every day in life. He said, of all the creation God made, we're the supreme creation. And we are a case with God. He's working with us. And you might find out 1,000 years from now, some people you didn't give the time of the day to, and you acted snooty with them, became wonderful creatures. And you will see them in a full glory of being in heaven with God for all these years. And some of the ones you thought maybe were better than that, including your hope and yourself in that group, didn't come out so well at all. And it's a wonderful insight into reminding us we live where we are among the people that we're with. And he has a wonderful way of writing. It's not psychiatric. It's not bland sociological charts. It's the real thing about what those people were like and what they believed and thought at the time. Okay. Questions and responses. And I just want to say Lewis is worth it. And this is my final one. How many of you have ever read any of the sermons or the materials of Eugene Peterson? Okay, a bunch of you. He was starting a brand new Presbyterian church in Bel Air, Maryland. And he stayed there 29 years till it became 500 years strong, 500 members strong. Now, my good friend, Quinn Pugh, who was the director of the Metropolitan New York Baptist Association, had a Baptist church in Bel Air, Maryland, and knew him. He went to several pastoral fellowships that they had. He was a good guy and really smart. He'd trained at in archaeology and in Old Testament, never completed his doctorate, but he was in the program, admitted to it. And you know that he did the translation of the entire Bible, which is an astounding piece of work. His printed sermons are masterpieces of thoughtful theology and application, and really good. And found out one of his secrets. He would tell his secretary when the church got big enough to have a secretary, he said, now here's what you write in your book for the day, in the calendar for the day. Pastor in office, and then write FD for three slots. And she'd say, well, okay, if that's what you want, what does FD stand for? He said, Fyodor Dostoevsky. We all need to read the Brothers Karamazov. It's one of the most deeply religious books ever printed in the whole world. And I'm getting so much out of it, I can't let it go. Now, he worked hard. He grew his church, and he did what he had to do. But Lewis is the type of guy that you don't have to be embarrassed to anybody. Say you've been reading a C.S. Lewis book. Some of it you didn't understand. Some of it you put down, you tried another one, and it was okay. He is a thoughtful writer. He is such a good writer that his works have been anthologized in secular English textbooks in university after university because his style is so crisp, so good. He minimizes adverbs and adjectives. He uses good common sense and structures in his sentences, but sticking with the main Anglo-Saxon words. He's just a master of communication in print. And taking that and using that as a basis for a sermon, Chuck, that's a pretty good idea, isn't it? that's the good part. And he's good at it. He will be a friend. And I recommend that you try some of these things. And remember, if you think you don't see something on here that you like, you got to go through 60 something choices before you eliminate all of them. And all of these are still in print, and most of them are available in inexpensive editions. And if you get the GBD catalog, is that the gospel books? I forgot. Okay. CBD catalog that comes periodically to my house from years and years of working with them. And they have his books. He's listed all of his books, and a great many of them very inexpensive paperback prices, even discounted. And it might be a good fun thing to put by your bed one night and to start with it and nibble at it. Not like you're having to sweat through a sermon, but just because, you, like Eugene Peterson saw, I need 3 hours with Dostoevsky this day to make my soul rich so I can help others. And I don't think he was lazy. I just think they had different ways of doing ministry from me. Okay, please, any comments? Anything's admissible. Okay, Bob, did I see your hand? No, you're scratching your head, I think. Okay. Can you hear me? I hope.
I don't know enough to ask any questions.
Okay.
No.
Well, I want you to know that you knew enough that when you went to Wilton Baptist Church to fill in, they really appreciated your good ministry there. I had the privilege of working there 8 years. And
Yeah, I saw your tailwind up there. That was memorable.
Yeah, it was
sad that it no longer exists.
Oh, it is. I'm heartbroken over that.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else like to make a comment? Anybody here read the Chronicles of Narnia? Some of them? Your children did?
Yeah, I have read a little of that, but I don't.
It was written so much. Go ahead.
Yeah.
There were TV programs about him. There were some kind of comic character kinds of versions of a couple of the Chronicles, and they would put them on children's TV. in the 60s when my kids were growing up. And that was so important to them. When they'd come to our house, they would start vying for the parts of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Who wanted to be Peter? Who wanted to be Susan? Who wanted to be Lucy? Who wanted to be Edward? And I could tell by the parts they chose that they were reading that book and trying to understand it. Nobody wanted to be the second son that gave up his honesty for Turkish taffy and so forth. And I'm glad I introduced them to them because I know they've read some of them. Any others? Good or bad? Oh, by the way, Lewis was awarded the, I think it's called the OBE, the Order of the British Empire, because in Mere Christianity, these were broadcast talks on BBC in the middle of Luftwaffe bombing raids in London. And BBC wanted to calm the people down in their homes and to share with them common sense messages and words of hope. And those were the principles that made these 3 sets become of broadcast on BBC that Lewis got to do over and over again. He had a good, clear speaking voice. And it was said there was only one other person whose voice was more popular, more understood than Lewis on BBC in World War II. Do you know who that might be?
Churchill.
Churchill, of course, the prime minister. But Lewis was number 2 in that.
Wallace, you mentioned that he was never appointed a professor. Is there a reason or reasons for that?
Yes. It goes back to the 1947 book that he wrote on miracles. And they were already building up a case in the departments. They thought it was not the done thing. It's only Britishers can think. To have a guy who's teaching English deciding to write religious books, that he just couldn't be that good. For one, the Christians couldn't be bowled over with it. And secondly, we won't read them because we know they're not any good. We want to see his scholarship. And that built up over the years. And he was there, let's see, 1925 until 1954. And Cambridge gave him a full endowed chair with all kinds of perks. And 1954, as much as he hated it, he left Oxford and went to Cambridge to teach. And that helped him in his latter years to store up a little bit more money. He was a real tightwad, by the way. He didn't want to spend money on anything. And he was very careful about not to do that. But that's the main thing. They were not believers in Christ. And 2, they were jealous of him because he was making money off of these books that weren't even pertinent to his discipline. And on top of that, a little later, he got married. And he married Joy Davidman, in 54, 55, no, it was 56 or 7. He had already gone to Cambridge. And they didn't like her. And so he was just not doing the things that a good British professor ought to do. And oh, by the way, another thing, when he lectured, the lecture halls were overflowing. Some of the other faculty, when they lectured, 5, 6, 12 people show up. It's just flat jealousy. The lady who replaced him in his chair and modeled in his period was named Gardner. And she said that this book was the finest book of English scholarship she had ever read. But the other people wouldn't give him credit for it. So it's jealousy, it's vanity. And when he went to Cambridge, he was given an endowed chair. He had a very full-fledged introductory lecture that he got to give, and great classes and all kinds of opportunities to write books there. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you, Wallace.
And now think about this as a Christian. you try to ask, how can I, what do I need to do to act like a Christian and be a Christian, even if I'm in a non-Christian place? I had a group of corporate people in my church in Wilton. Some of them were as high up as number two in a large corporation, and billion-dollar budgets they were responsible for. They got the idea that they would like to start some Bible studies in their corporate headquarters. And they came up to me one Sunday and said, you know what? We've got more Sunday school teachers than we need. Can you imagine that? The church, I was getting the best work of a whole bunch of Baptist pastors all across the country who came in my church because it was the only Baptist church for miles around. And I said, well, let's don't can this yet. Let's talk about what we can do. And we planned to teach Bible studies. We researched them and found simple ones, and also to use the newly published and read by everybody today's English version by the American Bible Society, which is now the Bible given out at Georgetown College graduations. Bob Bratcher was the author of that. And he was a missionary in Brazil for years and a great linguist working for the American Bible Society back home in New York. And people started coming, and they told, and you say, well, you know, gosh, that must have made people mad. No, they would do it at the lunch hour. And they had already gone to the manager who runs the building, the corporate building, to make sure that they had a room, that they stayed within their time limits, and that all would be welcome, secretaries or presidents. And they had the whole gang. And at one time we had, I think, 5 different corporate headquarters with Bible studies going. So I guess there are ways you can act out how you're a Christian. You might do like one of the students in my former interim churches. He used to have a new shirt on every day. It had a different scripture on it. And he'd go to work on the assembly line, and he couldn't say anything. He couldn't teach a Bible study, but he'd have a quote worth paying attention to on the front or the back. I don't know how he kept up with it. It's pretty expensive after a while for assembly line worker. But he was serious about it, and he tried to stay within what's done for good manners, but at the same time, be faithful in his witness. So if God puts you in that kind of, oh, by the way, in living in the Northeast, you find out that all the people put together go to any kind of church or place of worship on Sunday morning is probably less than 25% the population of the whole town or the whole area, however the census is done. There were only 2 evangelical churches in a town of 18,000 people. We were the only Baptist church for 30 miles in any direction. And there's only one other evangelical church. It was Evangelical Free Church. And we worked together on some projects, but a lot of people simply just didn't understand who we were and how we were doing things. And so you just run across that. And when you go into a university and all of you had teaching experience, if you get the cold shoulder from a certain group there, or they somehow get at cross purposes with you and you with them, it's not a very lovely place to stay in after that, is it? And Lewis stayed a long time in Oxford because he loved it. It was so dear to him. He won 3 degrees from there. Okay, any other questions?
Oh, Wallace, I'm a practical person in some ways. So I was using my phone to look up YouTube to see if there was any free stuff on Lewis. I found a subscription thing that you pay for and get a video on him once a month. So, but I'm going to do some more exploring because I thought everything was on YouTube.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I can maybe help you some with this later. I got to do some looking.
Well,
I'm gonna tell you
one of the things they were pushing was mere Christianity.
Yes.
And so anyway, I'll explore this more.
Okay. Well, let me know how it is. If I can help you, I will.
Okay.
Lewis, there's a trust that came together after Lewis died, and Warney, his older brother, outlived him by 11 years. But after he died, they had to set up a special trust, and they got property rights to everything about him. And when I wrote this 26, 27 page article for this book that Westminster published, I had to pay, I think it was about $327 of royalty fees to quote 2 or 3 lines here, 2 or 3 lines there from Lewis books. And that was the stingiest I've ever seen anybody be with their copyright. But I think that's quite an industry. There are all kinds of books coming out on Lewis now, books about Lewis, how he taught people to pray, how they did this, how they did that. But what they've done is gone through his corpus of writings, gleaned things off a computer, put them together in some type of order, put a nice cover on it, and then charge you for it. And they command pretty good prices. So it's quite possible, Bob, that you've got the same thing. Your local library would have the Chronicles of Narnia, the latest award-winning Peter Jackson movies, if you wanted to see those. There are teaching things done on him. There was a great debate that went on at Harvard on him in the late 90s. And I think it's available. But it might be that they're just squeezing you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I've got a few of his books that I can pick back up and read a little bit.
All right.
But I about decided it's too late for me to become an expert on anybody. So
Well,
I just listen to guys like you.
You don't worry about becoming an expert. Just jump into it and see if you like it. And if you don't, any library is going to have C.S. Lewis books in.
Oh yeah.
And some people would dismiss the Chronicles of Narnia, thinking that's only a children's book. It's written at a very high level. Lewis wrote a very highfalutin essay printed about why fairy tales are so very important to all ages. Yeah. And it's interesting because most of us, we have enough difficult stuff to read and we think, well, for the training we've had, we ought to go for that. But it's surprising when you run across principles that you want in understanding and you need to find out who's really writing the good stuff now. Okay. Anybody else? I'm sorry if I've overtalked and underlistened. We've got about 22 more minutes if you want to share anything. I don't know what's coming up next, frankly. I don't know how long this continues. I guess we'd have to talk with Andy about that, or David.
David, yeah.
Wallace, Charles Warford here. I picked up a little book. I think it came out in 1947, Miracles, a Preliminary Study. Can you tell us what impact that might have had?
I'll be right back.
Yes, sir. That's the one that placed him on top or on the front of Time magazine.
Okay.
Because at 47, just 2 years, a little less than 2 years after World War II, and there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of casualties in Britain, and a food shortage that lasted for years. So there's not a good feeling about that. This was published by an American magazine, popular magazine, but it sold like hotcakes. And he has some of his quotes in there and some of his thinking. It'd be worth it to look at it if you can get a copy. And he wrote up until there was a book ready at the printers for 1964, but he himself didn't live to see it. Oh, by the way, Lewis couldn't stand church hymns, and he and his brother Warnie would often slip out towards the end of the service when they started playing a lot of organ music.
They're going to come in and sweep.
Well, I'm through. I'll come in now.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we through? Over and out?
Well, Wallace, this has really been interesting. And I can tell you've studied a lot and know a lot about C.S. Lewis. I've read some of his books.
You're
but
kind
I've
to say
not
that. I hope so.
the
I'm just a
background like you
salesman
have.
for some of the Lewis stuff. And it's meant a lot to me. And so it's like when you find a good thing, it's such a joy to go share it with somebody else and maybe encourage them to try it. They wouldn't have thought about it. Hope that'll be good to you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I really would like something.
Some people say I can't justify if I'm heavens. I was a parish minister long enough to know how ragged those schedules are and how many unexpected things just demand your attention. And so I guess walking with your time is carefully, but it really made me laugh when I saw Eugene Peterson sharing what he did. There's an article, and I take Christianity Today and Christian Century, and one of those two recently had an article. Oh yes, Christian Century, and it was from what's his name at Duke, how he's starting to not apologize and feel so sneaky about reading in his office now, because he said it's a good book, it's got rich teachings in it, and that stirs me up, and that's going to make me preach better. And maybe that's not going to last forever, but that's the way he handles it. I assume that you don't have any Playboy magazines in your desk drawers or bottles of booze. Working in New York, I knew pastors that had those. And I'm thinking it's going to be pretty hard to unclutter your mind from this to get to this on Sunday. And I'm not your counselor, but I can counsel you on this. You got two tracks running against each other here, and you're going to have to do some thinking about this. By the way, Lewis mentioned in Miracles, he did his one chapter on sex there is fascinating, and he makes this point. It's a correct theological point, that the worst sins are not the sins of the flesh, but they're the sins of the spirit. That you could be a heavy drinker, a philanderer, and two or three other things, and God will forgive you. But if you treat people with disdain or evil in your heart, or you run others down, or you lie about them, those are the ones that are very difficult to get unloosed from with God, and you're talking them over. So just remember, I think that's good theology, that the sins of the temperament are more deadly and deeper and harder with God to work with than the sins of the flesh. That's not to say you to go out and be a libertine, obviously. But Lewis agrees with that. Okay, anybody else still there? Y'all want to go home early for an early dinner, or what? I don't know what we do. Andy, are you still there? Probably not. He has a busy day.
Well, we're not sure. We don't have anything lined up for June at this point,
Okay.
but just stay tuned. We'll see what comes next. We may lay off a month or two, but I appreciate what you've
Blessings on
done,
each
Wallace.
of you.
Thank you so much for the time and effort put into that.
See my Chronicles of Narnia? Wallace? Okay.
So these two have checked out. I'm already off the grid. No,
Okay.
did you still?
Any other comments or questions? We appreciate Andy taking care of the technical side of all of this, particularly as busy as he's been today. And thank all of you for participating. We'll let you know what our next one is. There you go. C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia.
Is this one? Here's-
Thank you, David.
All righty, you all have a good evening. Thank you so much for participation. We'll be in touch later. Good to see you.